The lightning split the Kansas sky the exact moment Margaret Brennan felt the first hard shove against her back, sending her stumbling off the covered porch and into the gathering storm. Behind her, Constance's voice rang sharp as a whip crack over the rising wind, declaring that no whore's bastard would be born under her roof, that Margaret's husband had been dead 3 months, and the child she carried could not possibly be his, and that she would rather see the girl drown in the mud than allow such shame to stain the family name. The door slammed with such force that Margaret felt it in her bones, and then there was only the rain, cold and relentless, soaking through her thin cotton dress as she stood alone on the darkening road outside Dodge City, Kansas, with nowhere to go and a baby growing beneath her heart. Margaret wrapped her arms around her swollen belly, trying to shield the child from the worst of the downpour. Her hair, once pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, now hung in dark ropes against her face and shoulders. She was 5 months along, far enough that her condition was obvious to anyone who looked, far enough that finding work or shelter would be nearly impossible. The year was 1882, and a pregnant widow without family was lower than dirt in most people's estimation. Lower still when her own mother-in-law had cast her out like garbage. The accusation had been false, viciously and deliberately false. Margaret had been faithful to Thomas Brennan from the day they married until the day he died, thrown from a spooked horse and breaking his neck on impact. They had been trying for a baby, hoping and praying, and when she finally realized she was carrying his child 2 weeks after his death, she had thought it a blessing, a piece of him to hold on to. But Constance had looked at her with those cold gray eyes and done the arithmetic, twisting the dates to suit her own bitter narrative. Thomas's younger brother William stood to inherit everything if there was no legitimate heir, and Constance had always loved William best. Thunder rolled across the plains as Margaret started walking, though she had no destination in mind. The road stretched ahead into darkness, and behind her Dodge City's lights were already fading. She could not go back to the town, could not face the shame of begging from neighbors who would have heard Constance's version of events by morning. Her own parents were long dead, her sister married and moved to California. There was no one, nothing, except the storm and the road and the baby who would need her to survive. The rain came harder, turning the dirt road to mud that sucked at her boots with every step. Margaret's dress clung to her skin, heavy and cold, and she began to shiver uncontrollably. She knew she should find shelter, but where? The land stretched flat and empty in every direction, broken only by the occasional fence line or distant stand of trees. Her teeth chattered so hard she bit her tongue, tasting copper, and still she walked because stopping meant giving up, and she would not do that to her child. She did not know how long she had been walking when she saw the light. It wavered through the sheets of rain like a beacon, warm and golden, coming from a structure she could barely make out in the darkness. A barn, she thought, or perhaps a small house. She changed direction, stumbling over the uneven ground, her whole body shaking now with cold and exhaustion. The light grew closer, and she could see it was indeed a house. Modest but solid-looking, with smoke rising from the chimney despite the rain. Margaret reached the porch and nearly collapsed against the door. She raised one trembling hand and knocked, though the sound was so weak she feared no one would hear it over the storm. She knocked again, harder, using the last of her strength, and then her legs gave out and she sank to her knees on the wooden planks. The door opened, spilling light and warmth into the night. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, and for a moment Margaret could not see his face. Then he moved, dropping to one knee beside her, and she found herself looking into the most concerned brown eyes she had ever seen. "Madam?" His voice was deep and gentle, touched with something like shock. "Good Lord, what happened to you?" Margaret tried to speak, but her teeth were chattering too hard. The man did not wait for an answer. He slipped one arm behind her back and the other under her knees, lifting her as easily as if she weighed nothing, careful of her belly, and carried her inside. The warmth of the house hit her like a physical thing, and she gasped, her body unsure whether to welcome it or recoil from the sudden change. He set her down in a chair near the fireplace, then disappeared for a moment, returning with an armload of blankets. "We need to get you out of those wet clothes," he said, and then seemed to realize how that sounded because he flushed and added quickly, "I will turn my back. There is a screen in the corner if you can make it there. I will fetch something dry for you to wear." Margaret nodded, unable to form words yet. The man turned away, true to his word, and busied himself at a chest on the far side of the room. She managed to stand on shaking legs and make her way behind the wooden screen he had indicated. Her fingers were so numb and clumsy that the buttons of her dress defeated her at first, but she persisted, peeling the sodden fabric away from her skin. The man had draped dry clothes over the top of the screen, she realized, a large flannel shirt and what looked like long underwear, far too big for her but clean and blessedly dry. She dressed as quickly as her shaking hands would allow, then emerged from behind the screen wrapped in one of the blankets. The man had set a kettle on the stove and was stoking the fire higher. He turned when he heard her, and she got her first proper look at him. He was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and those warm brown eyes that had been the first kind thing she had seen all day. His face was tanned from outdoor work, with strong features and a jaw dark with stubble. He wore denims and a simple cotton shirt. The sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle. There was something solid about him, something steady, and Margaret felt the tight knot of fear in her chest loosen just slightly. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair by the fire. "The water will be hot in a moment. I will make you tea." Margaret sat, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. Now that she was beginning to warm, the exhaustion hit her like a hammer, and she had to fight to keep her eyes open. The man moved around the small house with quiet efficiency, and she took the opportunity to look around. It was a single large room, neatly kept, with a bed in one corner, a small kitchen area, a table and chairs, and the fireplace. Simple but comfortable, the home of a man who lived alone but took pride in his space. He brought her a tin cup filled with steaming tea, pressing it into her hands. "Drink slowly," he cautioned. "You are half frozen." Margaret obeyed, sipping the hot liquid carefully. It was strong and sweet, and it seemed to spread warmth through her veins with each swallow. The man pulled another chair closer to the fire and sat, watching her with that same concerned expression. "My name is Kade Yates," he said. "This is my land, about 5 miles outside of Dodge City. You are safe here." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. "Margaret Brennan," she managed, her voice rough. "I apologize for the intrusion." Kade shook his head. "No apology needed. What were you doing out in that storm?" His gaze dropped briefly to her belly, then back to her face. "If you do not mind my asking." Margaret looked down at the cup in her hands. She could lie, she supposed, but what was the point? He would hear the truth soon enough once he went into town. "My mother-in-law cast me out. She says the baby is not my late husband's, but it is. I swear before God it is." The words tumbled out, desperate and raw. "Thomas died 3 months ago. We had been married 2 years. This child is his legacy, but she will not believe it. She wants William to inherit, so she has called me a liar and a whore and thrown me into the storm." The silence that followed was terrible. Margaret kept her eyes on the cup, unable to look at Kade, waiting for him to order her back out into the night. Instead, she heard him let out a long, slow breath. "That is Constance Brennan you are speaking of?" Margaret nodded miserably. "I know the woman." Kade's voice was flat. "Bought a horse from her 2 years back. Meanest, most cold-hearted female I have ever had the misfortune to do business with. Tried to cheat me on the price and then claimed I had damaged her property when I called her on it. He paused. I knew Thomas a little. He came into the general store sometimes when I was there. Seemed like a decent man. He was. Margaret's voice broke on the words. He was good and kind, and he wanted this baby so much. We both did. And now he is gone, and his mother has taken even this from me. No. The word was firm, almost sharp. Margaret looked up in surprise to find Kade looking at her with an expression of fierce determination. She has not taken anything. You are alive, your baby is alive, and you will stay that way. You will stay here tonight, and tomorrow we will figure out what comes next. I cannot impose, Margaret started, but Kade held up a hand. It is not an imposition. Look at you, you are exhausted and half-starved by the look of it. When did you last eat? Margaret tried to remember. This morning, some bread. Kade stood, shaking his head. That will not do. I have stew on the stove, made this afternoon. Let me get you some. He would not take no for an answer, and truthfully, Margaret did not have the strength to argue. She ate the stew he brought her, thick with beef and vegetables, and felt life returning to her limbs. Kade ate as well, though his portions were smaller, and she suspected he was giving her the lion's share. They did not talk much while they ate, but it was a comfortable silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the drumming of rain on the roof. When she had finished, Margaret set the bowl aside and looked at Kade properly. Why are you helping me? You do not know me. Kade met her gaze steadily, because it is the right thing to do, because no pregnant woman should be thrown out into a storm, because your husband was a decent man who deserved better than to have his memory slandered and his wife and child cast aside. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I lost my own mother when I was 12. She died bringing my baby sister into the world, and the baby followed her 3 days later. My father drank himself to death 2 years after that. I know what it is to be alone, to have nowhere to turn. I will not see you suffer that if I can prevent it. The tears Margaret had been holding back finally spilled over, running hot down her cheeks. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She felt the baby move inside her, a flutter of life, and cried harder. All the fear and grief and exhaustion of the past months came pouring out, and she could not stop it. She heard Kade move, and then he was kneeling beside her chair, not touching her but close enough that she could feel his presence like an anchor. It is all right, he said quietly. You are safe now. I give you my word. Margaret believed him. She did not know why, did not know this man at all, but something in his voice made her believe. She lowered her hands and looked at him through her tears. Thank you, she whispered. Kade gave her a small, sad smile. You are welcome. Now, you need rest. Take the bed. I cannot take your bed, Margaret protested. You can and you will. I have slept in far worse places than that chair. The bed has clean sheets, and you need proper rest. He stood, offering her his hand. Come on. Margaret let him help her up, too tired to argue further. The bed was in the corner, a simple frame with a thick mattress and several quilts. Kade turned down the covers for her, and she slipped beneath them gratefully, still wrapped in his flannel shirt. The pillow smelled like soap and something else, something masculine and not unpleasant. She was asleep almost before her head settled, drifting off to the sound of the storm outside and the quiet movements of Kade banking the fire for the night. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee and bacon. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was, and then memory returned in a rush. She sat up quickly, one hand going to her belly, and found Kade at the stove, his back to her. Good morning, he said without turning around. I hope you like your eggs scrambled. Margaret pushed back the covers and stood, smoothing down the borrowed shirt. I should help. You should sit and rest. I am nearly done anyway. He glanced over his shoulder at her. How did you sleep? Better than I have in weeks, Margaret admitted. It was true. Despite everything, despite the fear and uncertainty, she had slept deeply and dreamlessly, her body finally able to relax. They ate breakfast together at the small table, and Margaret was struck again by how easy it felt to be in Kade's presence. He did not press her with questions or make her feel like a burden. He simply treated her like a guest, offering food and companionship without any expectation of repayment. It was so different from the cold hostility she had endured at Constance's house that Margaret found herself relaxing in spite of herself. After breakfast, Kade excused himself to tend to his animals. He had 3 horses, he explained, and some chickens, and they needed feeding and watering. Margaret insisted on helping with the dishes, and he did not argue, simply nodded and headed out. She washed the plates and cups in the basin, moving slowly, her body still sore from the previous night's ordeal. Through the window she could see Kade in the paddock with the horses, his movements confident and gentle as he worked. He was a cattleman, she guessed, or perhaps he broke horses for sale. Either way, he clearly knew what he was doing. When he returned, Margaret was sitting by the fire again, her hands folded over her belly. Kade poured himself a fresh cup of coffee and sat across from her. "We should talk about what happens next," he said carefully. Margaret nodded, though her stomach clenched with anxiety. "I need to find work, somewhere to stay. I have a little money, not much, but enough to get me started somewhere." "Where will you go?" "I do not know," she admitted. "Perhaps one of the other towns, somewhere Constance's lies have not reached. I can sew, I can cook, I could keep house. Surely someone will hire me." Kade was quiet for a moment, studying her. "Or you could stay here." Margaret's head snapped up. "What?" "Stay here," Kade repeated. "I have the room, and the work around the place is more than one person can manage sometimes. You could help with the house, the garden, the chickens, in exchange for room and board." "I cannot ask that of you," Margaret said, though her heart was pounding with hope. "You are not asking. I am offering." Kade set down his cup and leaned forward. "Look, I will be honest with you. This is a lonely life out here. I work from sunup to sundown. I eat, I sleep, and I do it all again the next day. It would be good to have another person around, someone to talk to. And you need somewhere safe to have your baby. This can work for both of us." Margaret wanted to say yes so badly it hurt, but she had to be practical, had to think of the consequences. People will talk. An unmarried man and a pregnant widow living under the same roof. The scandal would be terrible. "For whom?" Kade's voice was calm but firm. "I am not courting anyone. I have no family to shame. And you have already been cast out by your in-laws, so what more can they do to you? Let people talk. Out here we are far enough from town that it will not matter much." He made it sound so simple, so logical. Margaret bit her lip, trying to think it through. It was improper, certainly, but the alternative was so much worse, trying to find work while visibly pregnant, giving birth alone and friendless in some boarding house, raising a baby with no support and no safety net. At least here she would have a roof over her head, food to eat, and someone who seemed genuinely willing to help. "Are you certain?" she asked, searching his face. "You do not know me? I could be exactly what Constance claims." Kade smiled, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I am a pretty good judge of character, and I do not believe you are. Besides, what kind of man would I be if I sent a pregnant woman back out into the world alone?" Margaret felt the last of her resistance crumble. "Then yes," she said softly. "Yes, I will stay. Thank you, Kade. I will work hard. I promise I will earn my keep." "I have no doubt," Kade said. "Now I need to ride into town for supplies. Do you need anything? Clothes? Personal items?" Margaret thought of her belongings, still at Constance's house. "I have things, but I do not know if she will let me retrieve them. Give me the list of what you need most, and I will see what I can do. If she will not allow it, I will buy what I can in town." Margaret found a scrap of paper and a pencil and wrote out a list with shaking hands. Her clothes, her sewing kit, the small wooden box that held her few pieces of jewelry, and her marriage certificate. Kade took the list, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. I will do my best, he promised. I will be back before dark. After he left, Margaret set about exploring her new home more thoroughly. The house was indeed small, but it was well built and surprisingly comfortable. There was a good supply of food in the pantry, staples like flour and beans and dried meat. The bed where she had slept was made with care, the quilts clearly hand-stitched. She wondered if Kade had made them himself or if they were family heirlooms, remnants of the mother he had lost. She found herself drawn to the window, watching the road for his return, even though she knew it was foolish. He had only been gone an hour. But the silence of the house felt strange after the noise and tension of living with Constance, and she found herself missing his steady presence. To keep busy, Margaret started cleaning. The house was already neat, but she scrubbed the floors and washed the windows and beat the dust from the rugs. She moved slowly, careful not to overexert herself, but the work felt good, gave her a sense of purpose. This was her home now, at least for a while, and she wanted to take care of it. Kade returned as the sun was beginning to set, riding up to the house with a canvas pack strapped to his saddle. Margaret met him at the door, her heart in her throat, and was relieved to see him smiling. She was not there, he said as he dismounted, only a housekeeper who clearly had no love for Constance. She let me take everything on your list and sent along some extra blankets and a few baby things as well. Said she hoped you were well. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes again. That must have been Mrs. Henderson. She was always kind to me. Kade carried the pack inside and set it on the table. Margaret unpacked it with shaking hands, finding her dresses and undergarments, her sewing kit, the wooden box with her treasures. At the bottom of the pack were the blankets Mrs. Henderson had mentioned, soft flannel in gentle colors, and several tiny gowns for a newborn. Margaret held one up, and the reality of what was coming hit her all over again. In 4 months, give or take, she would be holding a baby. Her baby. Thomas's baby. Are you all right? Kade asked gently. Margaret nodded, clutching the little gown to her chest. Yes, just overwhelmed, I think. This is really happening. It is. Kade moved to the stove, beginning to prepare dinner. And you are going to be fine. We both are. That night they fell into an easy routine, eating together and cleaning up side by side. Kade told her about his day in town, the people he had seen, the gossip he had heard. Constance was apparently telling everyone who would listen that Margaret had run off with some man, that she had always known the girl was no good. Most people seemed to be reserving judgment, Kade reported, but there were those who believed every word. Let them believe what they want, Margaret said, though it hurt. I know the truth. Thomas knew the truth. That has to be enough. Kade looked at her with something like admiration. You are stronger than you think, Margaret Brennan. She smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. I have no choice but to be strong. This baby needs me. As the days turned into weeks, Margaret settled into life on Kade's ranch. She took over the household duties, cooking and cleaning and mending, and started a vegetable garden near the house. Kade worked his land, breaking horses and tending cattle, and came home each evening tired but content. They ate dinner together, talked about their days, and slowly, carefully became friends. Margaret learned that Kade had been born in Missouri, that his family had moved to Kansas when he was young in search of better land. He had worked on other men's ranches for years, saving every penny, until he finally had enough to buy this small piece of property. He had been here for 3 years now, building his herd, building his life. Have you never wanted to marry? Margaret asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Kade was quiet for a moment. I have thought about it, he admitted. But out here, there are not many women, and the ones who are here are mostly already spoken for, and I suppose I have been too busy trying to make this place work to give it much thought. You would make a good husband, Margaret said, meaning it. You are kind and hard-working, and you have a good heart. Kade looked at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Maybe someday, he said softly. As Margaret's belly grew, Kade became increasingly protective. He insisted she not lift anything heavy, not overwork herself, not take any risks. He brought her fresh milk from town, insisted she eat extra portions, worried over every wince or sigh. It should have been smothering, but instead it felt like being cared for, like mattering to someone. It had been so long since Margaret had felt that way that she found herself treasuring every moment of it. One afternoon in late August, Margaret was working in the garden when she felt a sharp pain low in her back. She straightened up, pressing a hand to the spot, and felt the baby shift inside her. Another pain followed, stronger this time, and she realized with a start that something was wrong. She was only 7 months along, too early, far too early. "Kade," she called, trying to keep the panic from her voice. "Kade, I need you." He came running from the barn, saw her doubled over in the garden, and was at her side in seconds. "What is it? What is wrong?" "The baby," Margaret gasped. "Something is wrong. It hurts." Kade swept her up into his arms and carried her into the house, laying her gently on the bed. "I am going for the doctor," he said, his face pale. "Will you be all right for an hour?" Margaret nodded, though she was terrified. "Go, hurry." She watched him ride out, pushing his horse to a gallop, and then she was alone with her fear. The pains kept coming, regular and strong, and she knew this was labor. Too early, but undeniable. She tried to remember everything her mother had told her about childbirth, tried to stay calm, but the terror was overwhelming. If the baby came now, it might not survive. She could not lose Thomas's child, could not fail him that way. Kade returned in record time with the doctor. An older man named Harrison, who had been practicing medicine in Dodge City for 20 years. He examined Margaret quickly and efficiently, then sat back with a grave expression. "The baby is coming. There's no stopping it now," he said. "But you are only 7 months along, yes?" Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Then we will do everything we can," Dr. Harrison said firmly. "I will not lie to you. It will be dangerous for both of you, but I have delivered early babies before, and some of them thrive. You must be strong, Mrs. Brennan." The labor was long and brutal, stretching through the afternoon and into the night. Kade stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement. Dr. Harrison worked with calm efficiency, and finally, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Margaret gave one last push and heard the thin, reedy cry of a newborn. "A boy," Dr. Harrison announced, holding up the tiny, wrinkled infant. "Small, but breathing. That is a good sign." Margaret reached for her son with trembling hands, and the doctor placed him on her chest. He was so small, his skin red and wrinkled, his eyes squeezed shut. But he was alive, and he was hers, and she loved him with a fierceness that stole her breath. "Thomas," she whispered, naming him after his father. "Thomas Joseph Brennan." Dr. Harrison stayed for several hours, making sure both mother and baby were stable. The infant needed to be kept warm, he instructed, and Margaret needed to nurse him as often as possible to build up his strength. It would be touch and go for the first few weeks, but if they could get him through that, his chances improved significantly. After the doctor left, Kade sat beside the bed, staring at the tiny baby in Margaret's arms with an expression of wonder. "He is so small," he breathed. "But strong," Margaret said, watching Thomas's little chest rise and fall. "He is a fighter like his father." Kade reached out tentatively, and Margaret guided his hand to touch the baby's tiny fist. Thomas's fingers curled around Kade's thumb, and Margaret saw something shift in the man's eyes, a deep tenderness that made her heart ache. "Hello, little one," Kade murmured. "Welcome to the world." The next weeks were some of the hardest of Margaret's life. Thomas was so fragile, so desperately small, and she lived in constant fear that she would wake to find him cold and still. But Kade was there, supporting her every step of the way. He took over all the household duties, brought her food and water, changed the linens, watched over the baby while she slept. He fashioned a small cradle from wood and lined it with the softest blankets, setting it beside the bed so Margaret could reach Thomas easily in the night. Slowly, miraculously, the baby began to thrive. He nursed well, gained weight bit by bit, and grew stronger. His cries became louder, more insistent, the sound of a child determined to live. And as Thomas grew, Margaret found herself watching Kade with new eyes. He was so gentle with the baby, so patient. He would hold Thomas for hours, walking him around the room, singing old songs in a voice that was surprisingly good. He made toys for the baby, carved from wood and sanded smooth, and hung them above the cradle so Thomas could watch them turn and spin. He was, in every way that mattered, acting like a father. And Margaret realized, with a start that left her breathless, that she was falling in love with him. It should not have been possible. She had loved Thomas, loved him deeply and truly, and he had been gone less than a year. But grief and love were not mutually exclusive, she was learning. She could mourn Thomas and still open her heart to the man who had saved her life, who had given her and her son a home, who looked at them both with such tenderness it made her ache. She did not say anything, could not risk ruining what they had built together. Kade had offered her room and board, friendship and safety, but he had never suggested anything more. She would not presume, would not push. It was enough to be here, to watch him with her son, to share meals and conversation and the quiet moments of the evening. But sometimes she would catch him looking at her with an expression she could not quite read, something warm and searching that made her pulse quicken. And she would wonder if maybe, just maybe, he felt it too. Thomas was 3 months old, a chubby, healthy baby with his mother's dark hair and his father's blue eyes, when Kade finally spoke what had been growing between them. It was a cold November evening, and they were sitting by the fire after putting the baby to bed. Margaret was mending one of Kade's shirts, and he was whittling a new toy for Thomas, the wood shavings falling in soft curls at his feet. "Margaret," he said suddenly, setting down his knife, "I need to tell you something." She looked up, her heart beginning to pound. "What is it?" Kade took a deep breath, and she saw that his hands were shaking slightly. "These past months, having you and Thomas here, it has been the best time of my life. I wake up happy. I look forward to coming home. I feel like I have a purpose beyond just surviving. And I know this started as a practical arrangement, but somewhere along the way it became something more, at least for me." Margaret set down her mending, her breath caught in her throat. "I have fallen in love with you," Kade continued, his voice rough with emotion. "With both of you. I love you, Margaret, and I love that boy like he was my own son. And I know it is too soon. I know you are still grieving Thomas, and I am not trying to replace him. But I want you to know how I feel. I want you to know that if you will have me, I will spend the rest of my life making you and Thomas happy. I will be a good husband to you and a good father to him. I swear it." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of sadness. "Oh, Kade," she whispered, "I love you too. I have been falling in love with you for weeks, maybe longer, and I was so afraid you did not feel the same way." Kade was out of his chair in an instant, kneeling before her, taking her hands in his. "You love me?" The hope in his voice was almost painful to hear. "I love you," Margaret confirmed, squeezing his hands. "You have been so good to us, so kind and patient and generous. You saved my life that night in the storm. But you have given me so much more than that. You have given me a home, a family, a future. How could I not love you?" Kade pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, and she felt his body shaking with emotion. "I will make you so happy," he promised. "Both of you. I swear it." Margaret held him tight, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. "You already do," she said, "every single day." They were married a week later in a simple ceremony at the small church on the edge of Dodge City. Dr. Harrison stood as witness, along with Mrs. Henderson, who had traveled from the Brennan house to attend. Margaret wore a simple blue dress, her best, and carried wildflowers that Kade had picked that morning. Thomas slept in Mrs. Henderson's arms throughout the ceremony, blissfully unaware of the momentous occasion. The preacher was a young man who asked no uncomfortable questions about the speed of the marriage or the presence of the infant. He simply blessed their union and pronounced them husband and wife. And when Kade kissed Margaret for the first time, she felt a joy so profound it brought tears to her eyes. They held a small celebration at the ranch afterward, just the four of them and Dr. Harrison, eating cake that Mrs. Henderson had baked and drinking cider. The older woman pulled Margaret aside before she left, tears in her eyes. "I am so happy for you, dear," she said. "You deserve this happiness after all you have been through. And that man of yours, he is a good one. You can see it in the way he looks at you and the baby." "I know," Margaret said, glancing over at Kade, who was holding Thomas and making him laugh with silly faces. "I am the luckiest woman alive." That night, after everyone had left, Margaret and Kade stood together in the doorway of their home, watching the stars come out. Thomas was asleep in his cradle, and the house was peaceful and warm. "Are you happy?" Kade asked, slipping his arm around her waist. Margaret leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I am happier than I have any right to be. After everything that happened, all the pain and fear, I never thought I would feel this way again." "You have every right to be happy," Kade said firmly. "You are a good person, Margaret, and you deserve all the joy in the world." She turned to face him, reaching up to cup his cheek. "So do you. Thank you for taking a chance on me that night. Thank you for seeing past the scandal, past the fear, and just helping someone who needed it." Kade covered her hand with his, turning his head to press a kiss to her palm. "I would do it again in a heartbeat. Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me." They stood there for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, and then Kade swept her up, making her laugh, and carried her over the threshold of their home like a proper bride. He set her down gently in the middle of the room, and she pulled him close, kissing him with all the love and gratitude and hope she felt. "I love you, Kade Yates," she murmured against his lips. "I love you, Margaret Yates," he replied. And the name sent a thrill through her. She was no longer Margaret Brennan, the cast-out widow. She was Margaret Yates, wife and mother, loved and wanted and safe. The winter passed in a blur of domestic happiness. Kade continued his work with the horses and cattle, and Margaret managed the house and cared for Thomas, who was growing by leaps and bounds. He was a happy baby, quick to smile and laugh, and he adored Kade, reaching for him the moment he came through the door each evening. "Dada," Thomas babbled one afternoon, his first real word, and Kade froze, staring at the baby in shock. "Did he just—" Kade looked at Margaret, his eyes wide. "He did," Margaret said, smiling through her tears. "He called you Dada." Kade scooped Thomas up, holding him close. "That is right, little man. I am your Dada, and I always will be." Margaret watched them together, her heart full to bursting. Thomas would never remember his birth father, would never know the man who had helped create him, but he would know Kade, would grow up with a father who loved him and protected him and taught him to be a good man. And that, Margaret thought, was more than enough. In the spring, when Thomas was nearly a year old, Margaret realized she was pregnant again. The discovery sent a mix of emotions through her, joy and fear in equal measure. She had almost lost Thomas, had nearly died bringing him into the world. The thought of going through that again was terrifying. But when she told Kade, his face lit up with such pure happiness that her fears receded slightly. "A baby," he breathed, reaching out to place his hand gently on her still flat belly. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Margaret asked. "Happy?" Kade pulled her close, laughing. "I'm over the moon. I cannot wait to meet this little one. And this time I will be with you from the beginning, every step of the way." He was true to his word. As Margaret's pregnancy progressed, Kade was attentive and loving, helping with Thomas, taking over the heavier chores, making sure she rested and ate well. He talked to the baby every night, his lips pressed to her belly, telling their unborn child stories and singing songs. Dr. Harrison monitored her closely this time, determined not to have a repeat of Thomas's early arrival. But the pregnancy progressed smoothly, and when Margaret went into labor on a warm day in October, exactly 2 years after Kade had found her in the storm, it was textbook. Their daughter was born healthy and screaming, with a full head of dark hair and her father's brown eyes. Kade wept when he held her for the first time. This tiny person who was part of him, part of Margaret, a symbol of everything they had built together. "What should we name her?" Margaret asked, exhausted but glowing. Kade looked down at the baby, then at Thomas, who was peeking curiously at his new sister from the edge of the bed. "What about Rose? My mother's name was Rose." "Rose Yates," Margaret said, testing the sound of it. "I love it. Rose Elizabeth Yates." "Perfect," Kade said, kissing first the baby, then Margaret, then leaning down to ruffle Thomas's hair. "Absolutely perfect." Life with 2 children was chaotic and exhausting and wonderful. Thomas was a doting big brother, always wanting to help with Rose, bringing her toys and singing to her in his childish voice. Rose was a calm baby, content to watch the world with her wide brown eyes, smiling at everyone who looked at her. The ranch prospered as well. Kade's reputation as a horsebreaker grew, and he had more work than he could handle. They hired a hand to help with the cattle, a young man named Jack who was hard-working and respectful. Margaret expanded her garden, selling vegetables in town, and started taking in sewing work from some of the local families. They were building something real, something lasting, and every day Margaret gave thanks for the storm that had brought her to Kade's door. On their second wedding anniversary, Kade surprised her with a gift. It was a small painting, done by an artist in town, showing the ranch house with Margaret and Kade standing in the doorway, Thomas at their feet, and Rose in Margaret's arms. "Our family," Kade said softly. "I wanted something to remember this time. These years when our children were small and everything was new." Margaret hung the painting over the fireplace, where she could see it every day. It became the heart of their home, a reminder of how far they had come and how much they had overcome. As the years passed, Margaret sometimes thought about Constance, wondered if the woman ever regretted what she had done. She never reached out, never tried to see Thomas, and Margaret found she did not care. Constance had chosen bitterness and spite, had cut herself off from her own grandchild. That was her loss, not theirs. Thomas grew into a bright, kind boy who loved horses like his father and had his mother's talent for gardening. Rose was more reserved, thoughtful, with a gift for drawing that showed itself early. When Thomas was 6 and Rose was 4, Margaret gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named Samuel and Luke, and the house was filled with noise and laughter and love. Kade proved to be every bit the father he had promised to be. He was patient with the children, firm when necessary, but always kind, always present. He taught Thomas to ride and rope, helped Rose with her drawings, played endless games with the twins, and every night, no matter how tired he was, he made time to kiss Margaret and tell her he loved her. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the children play in the yard. "Taking in a pregnant stranger, marrying so quickly, taking on another man's child?" Kade looked at her as if she had grown a second head. "Regret? Margaret, you and those children are the best thing that ever happened to me. I was alone and lonely and just going through the motions before you came. You gave me a reason to live, not just survive. How could I ever regret that?" Margaret leaned against him, content. "I love you, Kade Yates, more than I can ever say." "I love you too, he said, kissing the top of her head. "Always will." Thomas came running up then, breathless and excited with Rose on his heels. "Papa, can we go down to the creek, please?" Kade laughed. All right, but stay where I can see you and watch out for your sister. I will. Thomas grabbed Rose's hand, and they ran off together, the twins toddling after them. Margaret watched them go, her heart full. She thought of that night in the storm, the darkest moment of her life, when she had been cast out and alone and terrified. She thought of Kade opening his door, taking her in, giving her a chance, and she thought of everything that had come after, the love and the family and the life they had built together. What are you thinking about, Reese? Kade asked. How lucky I am, Margaret said simply. How grateful I am for that storm, as terrible as it was, because it brought me here, to you, to this life. Kade squeezed her hand. I am grateful for it too, every single day. The years continued to unfold, each one bringing new joys and challenges. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and Margaret and Kade grew older together, their love deepening with each passing season. They were not without their struggles. There were hard winters and dry summers, illnesses and injuries, moments of fear and doubt. But they faced everything together, united in their commitment to each other and their family. When Thomas turned 18, tall and strong and so much like the father whose name he bore, Kade legally adopted him. It was not strictly necessary. Kade had been his father in every way that mattered since he was an infant. But they both wanted it official, wanted the world to know that Thomas was a Yates. The ceremony at the courthouse was simple, just a few signatures on paper, but when it was done, Thomas threw his arms around Kade and held on tight, and Margaret saw both men crying unashamedly. Thank you, Thomas said, his voice muffled against Kade's shoulder, for everything, for being my father. Thank you for letting me, Kade replied. You have made me proud every single day. Rose grew into a talented artist, selling her paintings in Denver and even as far away as St. Louis. Samuel and Luke followed their older brother and father into ranching, the three of them working the land together, expanding the operation year by year. The ranch that Kade had started alone became a thriving family business, employing several hands and supporting not just the immediate family but their families as well. Margaret became a pillar of the community, known for her kindness and her good sense. She taught sewing to young girls, helped at the church, always had a kind word and a hot meal for anyone who needed it. People who had once whispered about the scandal of her living with Kade before they were married now spoke of her with respect and affection. She had proven herself 1,000 times over, and no one remembered or cared about the circumstances of her arrival in Dodge City. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Kade took Margaret back to the spot where he had found her that stormy night. The road looked different now, wider and better maintained, and the weather was clear and warm. But she remembered it perfectly, remembered the fear and desperation, the cold rain, the certainty that she was going to die. I stood right here, she said, pointing to a spot a few yards from where they stood. I had been walking for hours, and I was so cold I could not feel my hands. And then I saw your light. Kade pulled her close. Best thing I ever saw was you on my porch. This bedraggled, terrified woman, pregnant and alone. I took one look at you and knew my life was about to change. Did you ever imagine it would change this much, Sia? Margaret asked. Kade laughed. Not in my wildest dreams. 4 children, a successful ranch, 20 years of marriage. I thought I would live and die alone on that piece of land. You gave me everything, Margaret. Everything I never knew I wanted. You gave me my life back, Margaret said. You gave me a reason to keep going when I wanted to give up. You loved me when I thought I was unlovable, and you loved my son as if he was your own blood. You are the best man I have ever known, Kade Yates. They stood together in the fading light, and Margaret thought about the twists and turns that had brought them here. If Thomas had not died, if Constance had not cast her out, if there had not been a storm that night, she would never have found Kade. It was a strange thing to be grateful for tragedy, but she could not help it. Every terrible thing that had happened had led her here, to this man, to this life. Do you ever think about what you would say to Constance if you saw her again? Kade asked. Margaret considered the question. I used to fantasize about it, about telling her how wrong she was, about showing her the life I had built, but now I think I would just thank her. Thank her? Kade sounded surprised. Thank her for forcing me to leave, because if she had not, I would still be there, miserable and alone, mourning a man I loved, but living with a woman who hated me. I would never have met you, never had Rose or the twins, never built this beautiful life. So yes, I would thank her. And then I would walk away and never think about her again. Kade kissed her temple. You are a better person than I am. I would probably punch William. Margaret laughed, the sound carrying across the empty plains. No, you would not. You are far too much of a gentleman. They headed back to the ranch as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The house was full of light and noise when they arrived. The children and grandchildren gathered for the anniversary celebration. Thomas had brought his wife and their 2 daughters. Rose had traveled from Denver, and Samuel and Luke were there with their respective sweethearts. The table was laden with food, and after the meal, Kade stood and raised his glass. 20 years ago today, I married the love of my life. I was scared out of my mind, worried I would not be good enough for her, worried I could not give her the life she deserved. But she took a chance on me, just like I took a chance on her. And together we built something incredible. To Margaret, the strongest, kindest, most beautiful woman I have ever known, thank you for 20 years, and here is to at least 20 more. To Margaret, everyone echoed, raising their glasses. Margaret stood, her eyes wet with tears, and looked around at the faces of the people she loved. And to Kade, who saved my life in more ways than one, who gave me a home when I had nowhere to go, who loved me when I thought no one ever would again. You are my hero, my husband, my best friend. I love you more today than I did 20 years ago, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. The celebration went late into the night, filled with laughter and stories and music. Margaret danced with Kade, with each of her children, with her grandchildren, her heart so full she thought it might burst. This was her family, her legacy, everything she had fought for and worked for and dreamed of. As the guests began to leave and the house grew quiet, Margaret stood at the window, looking out at the land that had become her home. Kade came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I am the luckiest woman in the world," Margaret said. "That I would go through that storm 1,000 times if it meant ending up here with you." "I am the lucky one," Kade argued. "You could have ended up anywhere, with anyone, but you ended up with me." "Exactly where I was meant to be," Margaret said firmly. She turned in his arms, looking up into the face she loved so well, the face that had become home to her. "I love you, Kade. Today, tomorrow, always." "Always, Homer," he agreed, and kissed her as the stars came out overhead, the same stars that had watched over them that first terrible night, the same stars that would watch over their family for generations to come. Their story became part of the local lore, the tale of the cowboy who took in a pregnant widow during a storm and ended up with a love that lasted a lifetime. People told it to their children, used it as an example of kindness and faith and the unexpected ways that love can find you. And though the details might have gotten embellished over the years, the heart of it remained true. 2 people who had been alone found each other in the darkest moment and built a light that would never go out. Margaret and Kade lived to see their grandchildren grow up, to see the ranch expand even further, to celebrate their 40th and then their 50th wedding anniversary. They grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing down, but their love never dimming. They still sat on the porch every evening, still held hands, still told each other, "I love you," before they went to sleep every night. When Kade passed away at the age of 78, surrounded by his family, his last words were to Margaret. "Thank you," he whispered, squeezing her hand, "for everything, for loving me, for building this life with me." "Thank you for finding me," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for taking me in. Thank you for loving us both." Kade smiled, and then he was gone, slipping away peacefully with his wife's hand in his and his children gathered around him. They buried him on the hill overlooking the ranch, the place he had loved most in the world, and Margaret visited his grave every day, telling him about their children and grandchildren, about the ranch, about all the little details of life he was missing. She lived another 5 years, long enough to see Thomas's youngest daughter married, long enough to hold her first great-grandchild. And when her time came, she went peacefully in her sleep, a smile on her face, dreaming perhaps of a stormy night and a cowboy with kind eyes who had opened his door and changed her life forever. They buried her beside Kade, and on the headstone they carved both their names and a simple inscription: two souls lost in the storm who found each other and built a home. The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through the generations, each one adding their own chapter to the story, but the heart of it remained the same, built on the foundation that Margaret and Kade had laid down, on love and faith and the belief that even in the darkest storm, light can be found if you are willing to open the door. And on quiet evenings when the wind blew just right across the Kansas plains, people said you could hear it, the echo of laughter from the old house, the sound of children playing, the murmur of two voices speaking words of love. The ranch had been built on many things: hard work and determination and good land, but more than anything, it had been built on love. The kind of love that transcends time and circumstance, the kind that saves lives and builds legacies, the kind that lasts forever. Thomas took over the ranch when his parents passed, running it with the same dedication and integrity his father had shown. He taught his own children the values that Kade and Margaret had instilled in him, about kindness and hard work, about taking care of those who needed help, about building something that would last. And he told them the story again and again of the grandmother he had never known by that name, who had carried him through a storm and into the arms of the man who would become his true father. Rose painted a portrait from an old photograph, showing Margaret and Kade on their wedding day, young and hopeful, and so clearly in love. It hung in the main house, alongside the painting Kade had commissioned all those years ago, a testament to what they had built together. Visitors to the ranch always commented on them, on the love that seemed to radiate from the images, and the family would smile and tell the story, keeping the memory alive. The twins, Samuel and Luke, worked the land with their families, expanding into new ventures while respecting the traditions their parents had established. They built new barns and fences, bought more land, hired more hands, but they always maintained the original house where Margaret and Kade had lived. It became a museum of sorts, kept exactly as it had been, a shrine to the love story that had started everything. And every year, on the anniversary of that storm, the family gathered at the ranch. They would stand on the spot where Kade had found Margaret, where two desperate, lonely people had collided in the darkness and found hope. They would tell the story to the youngest members of the family, making sure they understood where they came from, what their heritage was built on, and they would toast to Margaret and Kade, to the love that had saved them both and created a legacy that would endure for generations. The story spread beyond the family, becoming part of the larger narrative of Dodge City and the surrounding area. Historians wrote about it, including it in books about frontier life and the challenges faced by women in the Old West. Romance novelists borrowed elements of it, though none could quite capture the raw emotion and genuine love of the original. And always, always, it came back to that simple truth. Sometimes the darkest moments lead to the brightest futures, and sometimes a single act of kindness can change not just one life, but countless others. Margaret and Kade Yates had built more than a ranch, more than a family. They had built a testament to the power of love, to the importance of compassion, to the idea that we are all just one storm away from needing someone to open their door. And in doing so, they had created something that would never die, a story that would be told and retold, inspiring others to be kind, to take chances, to believe in love even when everything seems lost. The ranch still stands today, a thriving operation run by the 6th generation of the family. The original house is preserved, the graves on the hill are tended, and the story is still told. And somewhere, In whatever comes after this life, Margaret and Cade are together, watching over the family they created, the legacy they built, proud of every generation that came after them and grateful for the storm that brought them together and the love that kept them that way, forever and always.